this is where the grey part is in this, of even if we are regulated as a payroll profession, what will we be regulated on? Does that mean now that I can say to a client, I can talk to them freely about how they might introduce a salary sacrifice scheme and pensions and what have you? Does that suddenly make me into a tax advisor? No, it wouldn't. We can talk around the peripheries and we can talk about how we operate it. So I'm watching with interest on what this will do to the payroll profession as a whole.
Hello everyone and welcome to November and December's edition of Payroll Question Time. It's the last one we are running this side of 2024. Just been having a really fun offline chat with the panel today. They're in pretty good spirits, having just undertaken a relatively painful conversation meeting / webinar. So we're in good spirits today. We're going to talk about some exciting things about payroll, including the future of the industry. Perfect timing as we were about to go into 2025. Can you believe we're only 6 weeks away from Christmas and 8 weeks away from a new year? So this is the last PQT. So just to remind everybody who's joining us today, there are going to be 2 polls today. That's your opportunity to really get involved in the conversation. I'll be asking our expert panel for their thoughts on the poll responses as well. There is an opportunity for you to ask any of the questions you like in relation to payroll. They do not have to be questions related to the topics we're discussing today. So if you've got a particular payroll challenge, question, obstacle, problem, put it in the questions box. The more challenging, the better. Always nice to put our panel under a little bit of pressure. If it's about tax in particular, Richard is your man. He's desperate to answer a few tax questions today. So put them in the chat box and we'll ask those as we go through. To remind everybody, we are recording this session, so you don't need to be busy scribbling down notes. We will also be sending you a copy of the slides at the end of the session today, and it'll be republished on the Payroll podcast as well if you want to listen to it again in audio only, or you can find it on YouTube as well. So no reason to take any notes down whatsoever. And finally, there will be a survey at the end. The survey is super important. That is your opportunity. There's over 100 of you already joined us today. This is over 100 of you have an opportunity to tell us what you want us to feature in future PQTs. We've got a real good run into the next one in January, which I think is going to be on the 30th. So please do let us know what you want us to cover, and we will obviously do our best to make sure we do so in the next Payroll Question Time episode. And last but by no means least, I'm just going to read out a quick legal disclaimer to remind everybody that this presentation does not provide definitive answers to individual queries, and in some places takes views on matters which are uncertain. It is not intended to be relied upon in any specific context or as a substitute for seeking advice, legal or otherwise, on a specific circumstance, as each case may be different. Right, let's get into the detail. Let's find out who our panelists are today. I'm going to begin with myself. I'm the host of today's show. I'm going to be facilitating the conversation. I've been working in payroll for over 20 years. I'm the host of the Payroll podcast, and I run JGA Recruitment, which is a specialist payroll recruitment agency with offices in the UK and the USA as well. So that's enough about me. Let me introduce you to our panel. I'm going to start with our tax expert today, Richard George.
Richard George, tax expert. No, sorry, Richard George, Director of Education at the Payroll Centre. Obviously, Nick is quite a short-term payroller. Simon's going to be leading 39 years. I sit on a number of consultations, as do my colleagues, part of the War 300, and we provide training and other support to the industry.
Fantastic. And moving from my left to right, I don't know if everyone sees it the same way I do, but I'm going to come to you, Karen Thompson.
Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here again for our next debate on our legislative subjects and others. I'm Karen Thompson. I'm partner and head of payroll for a firm of accountants, head office in Carlisle, Armstrong Watson. I'm proud to be a chartered member of the Institute and part of the Reward 300 group as well. And I look forward to hearing all about Richard's newfound tax advisory.
That's amazing.
Absolutely.
Moving
from left to right, I'm going to come to Matthew Equig.
Hi, thank you very much. I think this is the first time I've said this. Merry Christmas, as this is a December edition as well as the November edition. So I'm Policy and Research Officer at the Chartered Institute of Payroll Professionals. So it's my job to keep up to date with all the legislation coming in the payroll world and responding to consultations and sitting on forums, that sort of thing. But the Chartered Institute is also there for any help and guidance that people need. We've got the advisory service, training, qualifications, and consultancy as well. So speak to the guys in the office if you want any help with that.
I was hoping to put a Christmas jumper on today. My family told me you have to wait till the 1st of December. It's such a shame, but it is, of course, our December edition. So in the Christmas spirit, to our last wonderful panel member, Simon Parsons.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. Simon Parsons, Director of UK Compliance, it tells me there, for SD Works. I've been in the industry for 40 years. I guess I joined Centerfile in 1984. I was part of NatWest Bank, and SD Works, of course, is the took over that business following Ceridian, etc. So my background is IT predominantly, and system software design, payroll services, considered a payroll legislation expert in the UK. I'm a fellow of the CIPP, have the Master of Science in Payroll Management, and chair IRENE, which is Electronic Exchange with Government User Network, and the BCS Payroll Specialist Group. And here to share my inevitable brain, which seems to just suck up payroll knowledge.
It's because you're everywhere, Simon. For anyone that's on any other social channel, from LinkedIn to Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to Threads, Simon seems to be everywhere answering everyone else's payroll questions, which is why, if you have them, I guarantee you, he will have some kind of response. So do put it in the questions box and we'll challenge him live on this show. Right, let's find out what we're going to be talking about today then. Today's discussion topics are going to be the budget 2024. I know we covered that last time a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about the knock-on effect it's going to have on businesses. We're going to be talking about raising standards in the tax advice market, mandatory payrolling in kind, or PBIKs, which I know is always going to be a hot topic of conversation for everyone, particularly as many of you may have been involved in various meetings that have taken place relatively recently. We're also going to be talking about the future of payroll. So anything here that you are interested to know more about, perhaps you've got a question, a query, you're nervous, you're anxious about something to do with the future of payroll. Everyone on this panel, including myself, has a very different lens and probably a very different perspective on where we see the industry moving. So please let us know. It'd be great if some of you could help us navigate that conversation, give us some direction on the things you want us to talk about, and we'll be bringing up some interesting concepts ourselves as well. And then we're going to be talking a little bit about the latest from the SD Works Academy, as well as any hot topics, any additional Q&As you want us to run through. Lots to get through today. They'll be finishing with a final reminder for when the next PQT will be, which will be in January 2025. So let's jump back into the budget 2024. I still can't get my head around quite what was delivered. That's a personal view, but let's find out a little bit more about the knock-on effects. We're going to talk about national minimum wage, employers' national insurance, salary sacrifice, fair work agency, and everything else you need to know as well. I'm going to come to Simon Parsons to kick us off.
Okay, so I guess the first area of discussion and getting moving is on the impact on employers on costs. And the two angles we've come up with there are: one, national minimum wage, and the other is employers' national insurance increase to 15% from the current 13.8. And what does that mean? But even more importantly, the drop of the secondary threshold to its low level. So much more employers are captured into paying national insurance. And it's probably ruined all the directors' payrolls out there as well, for those single company directors that seem to start their payments, as it were, their earnings at low levels, that now actually they're all captured into employers' national insurance. Maybe the view of government is that's a good thing, because the average earnings of directors is significantly higher than those single director companies. And also we've got measures that have come out in the budget that equally are tackling tax avoidance areas. That's probably not on the list there, of umbrellas as well, and seeing how that impacts. Of course, the problem with umbrellas and IR35 cases quite often is, or other types of situations, is the employee ends up paying the employer's national insurance contribution. And so the costs affect those working people as well. So there's the first area. Now, I guess the subject there on salary sacrifice is that there is opportunity for expanded offset However, expanded offset under salary sacrifice arrangements of reducing your earnings, of course, is that earnings have to be significantly above national minimum wage to do that, because you can't sacrifice below national minimum wage levels. But I think the first area there that I guess I'm kicking off with, Nick, is how is this impacting business? We've already heard some major names, maybe it's got nothing to do with it, but major names that are cutting jobs, holding back, not wanting to expand, or even have gone into administration. Although some of the reasons for them going into administration may not be the budget at all, or those proposals, but it might just have been the final nail in the coffin for them.
For sure, particularly for those on low margins. We're seeing a lot of news come out on hospitality and retail and those kind of businesses that are already on very low margins. I can see the panel nodding along there. Anything you'd like to add, Matthew, from a CIPP perspective? What are some of the knock-on effects you've seen from your members, perhaps some of the inquiries that have been coming into the CIPP with questions? It'd be great to get an insight.
Yeah, so exactly what you just said there. It's some of those sectors that are going to be hit a little bit harder. The retail, hospitality, care sectors is the ones we sort of hear about quite a bit, especially with that national minimum wage rise on top of the NI. And I think it's important for those sort of sectors, or people working in those sort of sectors, to remember that the national minimum wage increases are a first step. The new remit from or to the Low Pay Commission is to get rid of that 18 to 20 age band, and this is the first step towards that. So they saw, was it about an 18% increase on that wage band, or 16.3 that one was, sorry, on that particular wage band. And that's to try and bring it up to that national living wage level. So potentially next year, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a further increase of about 10 to 15% to bring it that much closer to that national living wage level. So planning there is going to be really key in making sure that you survive not just this round of employer cost increases, but potential future ones as well. And then just touching on that salary sacrifice piece, it's very important that you reassess workers who are in salary sacrifice arrangements to make sure that where they were previously compliant, they are still compliant, because a national minimum wage compliance check is definitely not something you want to fail with the naming and shaming and these the issues that can come with that. Although I think there are certain dispensations around salary sacrifice arrangements that can accidentally drop people out of that. However, I wouldn't want to bank on that, because it can still cause you some reputational damage. I suppose other things that we've been being asked, and I'm sure Simon and Rich will probably back this up, people asking questions on how to claim the employment allowance with the different restrictions being taken away from that, and how to claim it on multiple companies. Now, the gov.uk website, they've highlighted in their guidelines for compliance, the guidelines for compliance 10, which tells you all about linking companies and how they can be deemed as linked to make sure that you don't claim more employment allowance than you're entitled to. So definitely something to check out for people who have multiple linked entities, whether those are different companies or sort of parent companies.
Something I'm going to come to you, Karen, in just a moment, but something we've started to see, which surprised me slightly, although it probably makes sense on reflection. Obviously, we work in recruitment, so we're talking to clients about their future planning requirements and whether this NIC increase is going to have an impact on what they're planning to do. We've actually seen a lot of employers saying, well, actually, we're probably going to look further afield, because now the price is so expensive for talent in the UK, we're only be a little bit more open now to taking talent on in different locations. Even if you're using a service provider in EOR, there's margins applied, but the gap now has obviously come down a little bit because the price of UK talent has gone up. So I'd be interested to know, for someone like yourself, Karen, that manages lots of smaller payrolls as well, sort of companies the size of mine and bigger as well, whether you're seeing some of the similar trends. I don't think that's something maybe even the government would have predicted. They probably thought that we'd either be able to handle it, or that people will find jobs in public service or whatever. But we're starting to have those conversations with companies that are saying, actually, Nick, maybe we're going to look at talent further afield, and does this talent exist, and can you do some talent pooling and some research? What are some of your clients seeing on the accountancy side? Obviously, you work with a number of different clients to process payrolls for.
Yeah, I mean, on that, I mean, offshoring is one option for accountancy firms in particular. It's not one for Armstrong Watson, but that they will look at, is it cheaper to have resource, particularly on if you take payroll processing, not so much the expertise, but where your data input, things like that, is it possible that that can be offshored? So those conversations, I'm sure, will be happening with some of the accountancy firms if they've not already offshored. That is, which some of them might do. What we're seeing the national wage and employer national insurance and what have you, is it was interesting, Simon, you referred to directors. Of course, we're getting queries of, okay, if there's 2 directors, can I claim the employment allowance? And of course, we all know the rules, that they've both got to be over the secondary threshold to be able to be doing anything. And it's a case, well, if I have 1 over, can I do it? So questions are being asked. One thing I find interesting, regardless of politics, is that this is the first time in my career of 30 years, and certainly in an accountancy firm, where we're seeing so much interest questions that have come out of a budget. So we've had to, clients are saying to us, well, what's my forecasting going to look like? Now, some may have software that can do that. We've actually had to design a spreadsheet tool to allow for clients to forecast. Now, where we do the payroll, it's not so bad, we can populate, but it's not gone live yet. So it will, it's free for anybody. But it is like a simple, it reminds me of JRS, Simon, where we're all creating these spreadsheets to try and calculate before HMRC got
Can you send
got
me
a
a copy?
calculator.
I've actually asked my accountant the same thing. I'll take a copy of one of those.
Yeah, no, send a link. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's got a disclaimer with it, as you like the disclaimers in
Sure,
it. So it's
I do.
basing on assumption that, that somebody where they go over 10,000, they will be put into automatic enrolment if they are of a certain age. So it relies on a date of birth. So it's quite, it will take off the employment allowance for each person, what have you. And obviously if it gets to 0. So it's quite a cruel tool, but it's something that will fork up. But it's the first time ever that we've been asked for something like this. A lot of uncertainty, but of course, don't forget, as Matthew was saying about the connected companies with employment allowance and what have you, is the apprenticeship levy as well. Now, okay, that's not going to affect the smallest of businesses, but those who are teetering on the medium, with the national wage increases and especially connected, it could take them over the 3 million. And then they're starting to pay the apprenticeship levy. Obviously, everybody is eligible, but physically where they're starting to pay. So I can see queries potentially coming in, particularly for you, Simon, maybe even to yourself, Richard and Matthew, around, is this right? This is what my software is doing, because of course it will look to it, but that in itself generates a bit more. The employment allowance part, the other parts we understand are still remain in place. So while the 100,000's gone, they've still de minimis aid, the directors' rules, as I've just said, the connected companies rules. To my knowledge, they are all remaining. So the questions still need to be asked, but there is this general assumption of, oh, that means I can have it now. So just as a caveat to everybody listening, do make sure, with national minimum wage salary sacrifice, I couldn't agree with the panel more. In fact, one of the most common is, the compliance within national minimum wage, particularly in the sectors that are likely to be the hardest hit. So the hospitality and others, where they are paying mainly at national minimum wage. We've just come across one where, unfortunately, for years, they didn't check salary sacrifice for the national minimum wage. Not one of ours, I'm pleased to say, but again, the arrears and the bill that's going to come with that would be huge. So checking that somebody isn't below. Some companies in the past would up the wages of people in order to accommodate for salary sacrifice because it was better all round. Will that see a change in behaviour? We'll wait and see. But a lot of questions being asked of, can I salary sacrifice? What does that involve, particularly around the pensions, more so than anything else? So yeah, a lot of uncertainty, I would say, and companies trying to find ways of how to mitigate some of these costs.
And
so
Richard,
to your
direct
point, Nick, I do think you might be busy.
Yeah, I think everyone's going to be busy. But from an educational point of view, Rich, what are the things that you're planning for? What are the educational side of things as we go into the new year that your clients are asking for?
It's business generally at the moment. So obviously going back to the salary sacrifice, all we keep hearing about is auto enrolment and pensions. It is everybody's focus because, you may have a quantitative number of your staff on low pay who you've auto enrolled into a salary sacrifice pension, the variation this year will have the biggest effect on that population, because all of a sudden they've been getting X and Y and making X and Y savings, and you may be having to pull it, e.g. move them out of a sacrifice pension scheme. And they may have been in it for 4 years, 5 years. So auto-enrollment seems to be very high profile, but not necessarily educationally, but just the net effect on business. And I think we're hearing of some really difficult conversations that are going on. If you think about, moving away from low pay and national minimum wage, net effect on the business is 3.9% per member of staff. Where's that coming from? And when you link that to the fact that wage growth has been so high while inflation has been so low, even though it has gone up a little bit, was it 2.3% on Monday? It went up to, where does pay sit? And I can imagine there are not only some very difficult forecasting questions going on in business, but I would expect there is a similar level of what the hell are we going to pay people next year? Because whether we like it or not, that 3.9% has got to be paid by somebody. And let's be real, and if you were going to give a percentage pay increase based on growth or CPI, is that still going to be applicable, feasible, or manageable with that extra cost? So I think there must be, I'm almost glad that I work in quite a small business, that some of the forecasting and growth questioning that must be going on at the moment must be as tough as it gets.
Well, I think it's not a payroll related question thing here, but let's not forget as well, there's less money to do it with because corp tax has also gone up. So that's an instant 5% reduction in profits for most organizations, which previously could have been put towards salaries and other bits and pieces. So it's a double whammy for a lot of small businesses, or all businesses, I should say.
Absolutely. But I think also on Karen's point is the offshoring. All of a sudden it becomes very, very appealing.
It does.
I must admit, I had the pleasure about a month ago of being in Kochi in India with one of the providers, working with a team out there. It's the fastest growing offshore in the world on the grounds that the expectation is they've got 30 to 40% growth forecasting in India already. So the one I was with has moved offices because where they had 500, they now have space for 900.
Yeah.
And, Bill, you go out there and it's just a building site because, people aren't stupid. People forecast as well from other countries and realize the value add that can occur. And I think, again, especially with larger business, compliant business and procedural business, it's going to become more attractive.
Well, we've had a client actually came in on Monday. It's not me personally that's managing the client, but we've worked with them for best part of a decade. And funnily enough, you mentioned India. They've just given us 2 UK payroll vacancies to be recruited for in India. That's the assignment we took on. I think that's a good example. Now, whether or not, I haven't asked the questions, I'm not managing it, whether that's a result of the budgetary changes, but certainly costs would have come into that decision-making process. And it's interesting because it's the first time that client we've supported for a decade has actually said, we're going to expand our team, which is great, but we're going to do so by hiring that talent elsewhere. And I wonder if that's just a random change or whether we're going to see this on a bigger scale as time passes. We'll have to wait and see.
But it's not an easy game either. I mean, part of the reason I go out there is retention. It is a circus because there are so many businesses doing exactly the same thing. So it's almost like airside at an airport. Once you're airside, you just rotate between the businesses. So it's a very challenging market. But given this current situation of cost, it becomes very, very appealing.
Well, let's find out what our listeners are thinking. I'm going to ask Simon to comment on the results when they come through, because Matthew raised a couple of questions that he thought Richard and Simon might have a view on. I just want to come back to that in just a moment. So the poll here is, of course, how significant will the impact of these budget changes be to your business? In your opinion, will there be a large impact, a medium impact, a small impact, or perhaps no impact at all? And the answer is fine. It would be good to see the results. While we're waiting for those to come in, please, if everyone can get involved, we've got 133 people, so it should be a pretty comprehensive poll here. It'd be really interesting to see the results. While we're waiting for those to come in, as Simon, I think Matthew suggested, you may have some additional commentary on the points that he made. Anything you'd like to add?
I'll have to remember what Matthew's points were, Nick.
Well, it doesn't have to be
that.
related to Matthew. Maybe just on all the comments everyone has mentioned. Anything you'd like to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll add some more comment on the salary sacrifice arrangements there, Nick, because of course, if people are having to cancel salary sacrifice arrangements because national minimum wage has risen, it's not just the 15% rise, is it? Because they weren't paying the 15% on that sacrificed amount. So they've got the one step, the 15% rise, and again, the 15% on monies they didn't used to have to pay it on, that they now have to pay, which is an interesting aspect. We could say the other little one that came out with the national insurance changes, of course, the test, great relief of the lower earnings limit, £125 has gone up £2. So that's going to save us on some of the tests, isn't it, that come along. But we do have some of the aspects of other change coming along, which then change that, because of course SSP is going to be made available for everybody at some point.
Sure,
but it'd be interesting to see. I mean, there's an element of how much noise are we hearing on the floor. For some, there's a lot of noise. For others, it's quite silent. But it may depend on levels, industry type, etc. But I think this is a worry, isn't it? Especially where you're providing service to others, because I guess there's an element of, and that's a consideration for outsourcing overseas. If their wage rates start to rise and demand increases, their costs may actually go up, which then means they'll charge more. And I guess there's an element of service companies here thinking this is significant, we're going to have to pass this on.
Well, maybe a slightly different change. Obviously, there's a lot of they're getting a fair bit of backlash on the budget anyway. Do we think there's any possibility the government may modify any of its plans announced in the budget? I don't know if you've heard anything, Matthew. I know a lot of you involved in consultations. There has been quite a strong response to it, and we know that the budget outlines the government's strategy, but it's not necessarily mutable. Do we think any changes may occur before some of these are implemented, or do you think they're pretty much set in stone now?
I think most of the backlash to the changes is fairly set in stone. Obviously, I wouldn't want to say things for certain, but it definitely seems to me that it's, new government coming out of the gate strong in terms of what they want to do and what they want to achieve, and they've put it out there, and there will be a response to that. But at the moment, I certainly haven't heard anything that would indicate anything that would be reneged on or changed in any of these areas at the moment.
Okay, interesting. I feel I had a different view. But let's have a look at some of these poll results then and see how people are feeling about the impact these budget changes may have on their businesses. So let's see if these come through. Maybe I'll come to you, Karen, to get your results on these when they come through. If we can just close that poll. So what have we got? I can't see the results now. Let's have a quick look. So we've got 39% said massive impact, 47% said medium impact, 13% said small impact, and only 1% said no impact. So really pretty close between massive and medium, 39 massive and 47% medium. What are your thoughts there, Karen?
I'm not surprised at all, because, if you have employees, you're going to be impacted. How many employees you have will determine how much of an impact that you've got. But I was just going to sort of, in line with that, you were saying about what's going on in the media, what have you. There is about whether the government will look to reverse or other, because obviously they're in talks with the likes of the NFU and things like that to do with the farming and inheritance tax. But there is actually a petition. You know how they do all these petitions, like proper government petitions, where nearly 3 million have now signed calling on the government to have another general election. So there is very, very strong feeling on these changes. But like Matthew said, whether or not something will change, I don't know. But given these impacts, it's on the employment costs initially, really. I mean, the CT and IHT and what have you obviously will impact certain businesses. So I'm not surprised by the results.
I think it'd be interesting as well to know, if you broke down the impact itself. So how much of that impact is national minimum wage? How much of that impact is cost? I think that'd be a very interesting thing to know.
I do know that the Times ran a report, if anyone read it. They said that following a lot of criticism from business leaders and economic experts, Rachel Reeves stated that a budget would not be repeated, and she did indicate a willingness to adjust fiscal policies in response to feedback. demonstrating the budget plans are subject to change as the government responds to various factors. So who knows? We'll have to wait and see. Right, let's jump into the next part of the show then. We're going to talk about raising standards in the tax advice market. Now, usually I'd come to Richard as our expert here, but I'm going to come to Simon instead. What do employers need to know?
Yeah, this is a strange one. I think you just need to know it's going on and what does it mean. So there's obviously been a lot of avoidance measures being taken over the years, and some consideration that the government wants to tackle, certainly HM revenue and customs. Predominantly that's probably been in the marriage allowance reclaim era, expenses reclaims, maybe even some of the coronavirus job retention scheme or other support measures that went in, which were a bit bogus. But there's been obviously millions or billions that have floated around that of potential avoidance or fraud, propagated possibly by people who claim to be experts in it or advertised. Some on the social media type areas where we both look at times. Used to annoy me with one particular or a couple of advertisers that used to come all the time saying you could get this, that back claims, where you think this is all nonsense, or you could do it for free yourself, even if you did qualify, yet they would take 60 to 70% of the money if you did get anything back. And also we've got the widespread misuse in the umbrella market to the extent that I'm sure there are compliant umbrella market users out there, so I don't want to denigrate them all, but the percentage of those involved in tax avoidance is a high percentage. You know, I think it almost reaches 30 to 40% of them are actually involved in it. And so the government have consulted these past 2 years on the tax advice market. Some of the people here will know that I've been quite vociferous in my responses to them in relation to payroll. And so far, I mean, even we're listed in the latest publication that we responded, but I can't see any of my comments published in the response. But the government announced that they're going ahead with mandation of the tax advice market for April 26. What does that mean? It means you're going to be regulated by somebody or other, but presently payroll is not regulated. We don't have to necessarily do AML unless you're doing certain duties. Karen probably has an advantage to the extent that she falls under an accountancy regulatory body, but there isn't a payroll regulatory body. So where are all the people that are operating small little bureaus, etc.? What's going to happen? And I don't know is the answer at the moment. Matthew may have some indications on early discussions of what will happen. I'm certainly in the forums and groups, but I don't get the answer to my questions. So I keep on asking, yeah, and what about this? And what about that? What does it mean? What does it mean predominantly for payroll software developers? Are we tax advisors? Now, the indication from the proposals was that they're not, but then it goes on, as long as you don't do. And then you look at the don't do's and you think, well, actually, we do. So therefore, we are captured by the tax advice market, because basically you're not a tax advisor unless you do anything taxy. Well, payroll does taxy stuff. So so you may be a tax advisor. And I know this is a specialist area of Richard's that he's got great interest in, but of the tax advice market. But equally, there'll be an obligation to follow the agent's code. Now, it's interesting because sometimes I see adverts and promotions, etc. And even sometimes we're challenged as a business. People will say, do you have HMRC approval for your service, and are you accredited? And it's sort of, no. SD Works will say, no, we're not. And they say, well, these people that are coming to us and saying, offering us their services, say they are. Well, I've got a bit of surprise for you. They're not, because no one is, because you can't, and it's contrary to the agent's code to claim it. So there's something a bit dodgy. But that's the problem with the tax advice market position I think that we're finding ourselves in. So many people have pretended they're almost HMRC. It's a bit like applying for, going off all over the place here, Nick, but if you want a G-HIT card to go away on holiday, you can get it absolutely free from the government direct in minutes. Or if you put in a Google search, it will probably take you to an organisation that will get it to you for 40 quid. And they will ask you exactly the same questions as if you get it yourself for free if you use the government. And I think we've found ourselves in a tax advice market where we've had lots of these pretenders coming in, which then mean that regulation's going to come in that will affect us all. So that's where I think we were going with this is this was announced, confirmed in the autumn statement as well, raising the standards in the tax advice market. Is it going to affect payroll processes? And we could think, well, I'm just the payroll department, so it won't affect me. Oh, except we do the payroll for the neighbouring company as well. Oh, you've just fallen into being a bureau or a tax advice or an agent. So actually, it may include you as well. So yeah, I think I'll let some of the others, but can you see the difference here? But there's an element of, there's a big, massive question mark coming for April 26th.
I think one thing, when you haven't got regulation, it allows people to create their own assurances. It's a bit like whether you're going into, I don't know, becoming a coach or a nutritionist. In any industry where there is no official regulation, it's very easy to get certified with relatively unscrupulous or not really any real
well, you'll get me making a
really to start trading.
Yeah, but I think it's the same in everything, isn't it? It's, you know, tax is one thing, but anything is, and it's partly down to social media. A good example: my daughter went to America. She Googled American visa, picked the first one, paid 150 quid. I take her to the airport. She hasn't got a visa. Well, it's the same around the world, isn't it? It's a principle that, whether it's social media has a lot to do with it, but just people generally trying to make money. It's staggering. But Simon was talking about people challenging his bureau. I'm sure Matthew's had it, and I'm sure Karen has, but we've had it too. People coming to us saying, you know, you're giving us this tax advice, but X, Y, and Z is saying that, and I'm paying them, and I think they're right. So you end up in a situation where, you know, HMRC are damned either way, because, you know, nobody's going to listen. They'll listen to what they want to hear to a degree. And I think it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, we did tell all our listeners that you do love to talk about tax, and there's a good example of that. So thank you, Rich, for jumping in. I'm going to come to you, Karen, as someone who obviously is an agent, or you work as a part of a bureau operation. You'll obviously have a slightly different perspective here. So I'm going to come to you last, Matthew, because you've nodded all the way through, and I know you've definitely got some content to add. So I'm going to get everyone's perspective first and come to you last of all. Karen.
So in a way, Simon's right. In a way, I'm quite fortunate, but I understand the dilemma. So if I go back, I'm like, okay, not 40 years, 30 years. So when I was a payroll professional, I was running payrolls. I did the construction industry scheme. I did employment status, decisions. I did benefits in kind of doing P11D. So I did loads of stuff as part of the payroll function, and that's why I've got the knowledge. Now, move me into an accountancy firm, which is regulated by ICAW, ICAS in Scotland and so forth, then the rules change. So whilst my knowledge is still there, and whilst I am desperate to help people and say, oh, yes, when I talk to my team, we have to refer. And it's quite simple. So for me, working in accountancy firms, as Simon said, there isn't a grey area as such, as long as you know what the line is. So for example, we operate salary sacrifice. We know that it can't take below national minimum wage. So we will run a programme to check if it is, for example. But the moment it does, and you're wanting a national minimum wage compliance audit done to check that you're doing okay, it falls outside of payroll. It actually goes to tax. Likewise, though, somebody wants to introduce a salary sacrifice for pension. Well, now here we have another dilemma. Is it our financial planning team, who are independent financial advisors, who can also advise on salary sacrifice and pension schemes, not anything else, but pension schemes, or is it the tax? So with this of what is or isn't deemed tax advice, for me, we have our company guidelines that says if it is, can I do this, or should I view this as a van, or should I view it as a car? That's advice. That falls outside of payroll. We refer that to tax. If, however, it says you're processing my company car through payrolling of benefits, how do you do it? We can tell them. So it's knowing those lines, and I think this is where the grey part is in this, of even if we are regulated as a payroll profession, and Matthew, I'm sure, has stuff to say on that. It's, well, what will we be regulated on? Does that mean now that I can say to a client, I can talk to them freely about how they might introduce a salary sacrifice scheme and pensions and what have you? Does that suddenly make me into a tax advisor? No, it wouldn't. We can talk around the peripheries, and we can talk about how we operate it. So I'm watching with interest on what this will do to the payroll profession as a whole. The fact that we are included, I remember with money laundering, my nemesis, KYCs and AMLs, no choice but to do them in my world. But if we remember, Simon, it was supervisory bodies. If you were a bureau, it's like, but when there's no money's transferring, there's no money's happening. But still, they were insistent that payroll bureau would fall under this. So Simon says, he's right. His comments, which I'm sure I would know what they are, aren't visible in anything that seems to be coming out. So is it falling on deaf ears? So yeah, watch this space. So for me, it is a bit easier. So those in the accountancy firm probably have it a bit better because we have to conform to everything anyway. But yeah, interesting to watch to see how it
Just
pans
on the
out
back
in the
also,
end.
Karen, is how do you quantify compliance?
Yeah, it's difficult. And then the other counter there, Karen, is I see lots of small firm, accountancy firm, payroll people on the social media asking questions, and it's clear that they haven't done the AML checks, and they are advising on things which, even as an accountant for an accountancy firm, are not allowed to. I mean, it's a common line I'll say, I am a qualified pension trustee. So therefore, I do know a lot about pensions, and you could ask me a question, but I'm forbidden to actually give pensions advice. I'm not allowed to. Could I make some comments? And there's an element. And some of you know, I am actually a regulated tax advisor. I'm registered, but not for SD Works. And then it gets, so that's me personally, and it gets down to that sort of level. And it's sort of, someone will ask you a question, and there's an element of, if you want me to give you some information, like this presentation today, I can. If you're wanting me to tell you about your specific circumstance, can you show me your passport, your driving license, and prove, and then I've got to go and check to make sure you're not a Russian oligarch and or associated with Putin or some terrorist organization around the world. Before that, I can't give you anything. And then if I find that you're trying to be a bit dodgy, I may have an obligation to report it without telling you. So don't ask me if you can get away with not paying tax or things like that, because if you do, I might just have to tell the authorities that that's what you're doing. And there's an element of, these are the sorts of obligations that you think, and I may be over-egging it a bit, and Matthew will correct us a little bit on what he knows latest. But that's the reality. But as you said, Nick, if you look at a lot of those named on the tax avoidance list published by HMRC, they may have been accredited as fully 100% compliant with the law by an organisation which they had formed themselves.
Absolutely right. Really good point. This happens a lot, which is why I brought it to everyone's attention. I think it is difficult for...
Well, Nick,
go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say as well, when Simon was mentioning like money laundering and smaller firms, I think it's important to understand that you don't just do that when you take on a client. We actually have to do it every year. And I imagine there'll be an awful lot who are not doing that. Because every year something changes. Are the directors still the same people? The owners, what have you, terrorists change, political interests change. So you should actually do it every year. For anybody listening who is in that world, if you do it once, that won't be enough.
Hello, HR and people leaders. Are you exhausted of the war for talent cliche? The problem is, when we hear a cliche, it usually exists for a reason. However, We think it's time for a fresh approach to the talent crisis. That's because at JGA Recruitment, we understand the real challenges you face in sourcing phenomenal HR and people candidates. And guess what? We think we have the solution. Our team is on a mission to revolutionize your hiring process. That's because we're not just recruiters, we're strategic partners dedicated to finding HR and people professionals who align perfectly with your company's vision and goals. So let's break the cycle of frustration together. Partner your talent acquisition strategies with JGA Recruitment and experience the difference in service, excellence, and results. No longer do you need to suffer the costs associated with a poor hire, because with over 100 five-star Google reviews and already trusted by many of the world's leading brands, why don't you take action today? Contact us at jgarecruitment.com to discover how we can help transform your HR and people teams. And here's a bonus. When you visit us, you can sign up for our weekly HR newsletter that's packed with invaluable industry insights and more. Let's revolutionize your HR talent acquisition strategies together and make the war for talent a cry from the past. Visit jjrecruitment.com to find out more.
Well, the other angle, Nick, is often people think as long as you're not handling the money, it doesn't matter. That's not true. If you're giving the advice, it still matters. It doesn't matter even if you don't handle the money.
Even more when all your friends, Simon, are Russian oligarchs, right? It makes it even more challenging. Now, I haven't come to Matthew yet. Nice. I promised that I would. I do think it's difficult, though, a little observation for me, because I had an employee ask me a pensions question. I had to say, I can't advise or ask you. Or in that case, the next thing they said is, can I ask payroll? I said, nope, you need to go somewhere else. Where do I go? I don't know. I can't really advise you on anything. But, go to our accountants. Maybe they can put you in touch with somebody. But it is difficult.
A local pub's a good place, Nick.
Yeah. So, Matthew, I know you've been nodding and listening patiently. I'd love to get your view. Obviously, this is something that you must be having a lot of inquiries about on a regular basis. So I'd like to come to you.
It's a lot to unpack. I think Simon's covered a lot of that fairly comprehensively. It is a difficult thing in terms of, are you giving advice or are you giving guidance? It's a source of great frustration, I think, for people who sometimes contact us for our advisory service, as I imagine Richard will probably get as well with the payroll centres, is that, as Karen said, is it this or is it this? Well, I can't tell you that. That's a decision you've got to make. So we are able to go, here's the guidance on how you can make that decision yourself, or you can seek further guidance. And that's a difficult position for anyone to be in, because it's, tying your hands. And as Karen said, sometimes it's so painfully obvious with things like salary sacrifice what you should be doing or what's the best thing to do. But to actually tell someone you should be doing this, is that then tax advice? So we're very wary of payroll as a profession straying too far into that, in terms of, do we need anti-money laundering regulation? Do we need professional indemnity insurance, and all these sort of things that would go along with that sort of tax advice spectrum? I suppose in terms of, should the profession be regulated, I think the CIPP would have a sort of brilliant time with that if it were, sort of probably standing to be in a fairly good position to try and be that regulator. But all we can do at the moment really is sort of ensure that people are upskilling themselves, doing CPD, making sure they understand what they're able to do. In terms of the consultations that have happened, I'm sure Simon's comments weren't published because they'd have to be heavily redacted if they were. But we're keeping an eye on them and seeing what's happening. I think the general idea seems to be that it would be business to business payroll processing or payroll provision that would be a little bit more regulated, and that they want to step into a little bit further. So at the firm level sort of thing, rather than individuals working within a firm. So in-house payroll teams probably won't be sort of caught with any extra burden at the moment. Not saying that won't happen in the future, but at the moment I would highly doubt that if you're working in-house for an employer, you can provide essentially advice to your employer on what to enact, because that is you internally within your own company. Whereas as a payroll bureau or payroll firm, dealing with another company and telling them how they should set up a salary sacrifice scheme, for example, falls under the remit of this, because you're essentially telling them how to minimize taxes, or NI in this case. As Simon touched on, we're really trying to focus and raise attention with the policy officials in charge of this at the moment, not necessarily around those bigger firms like Karen, like Armstrong Watson. Those sort of firms are, like you said, already caught under those sort of regulations through the accountancy side, and will have the internal processes to deal with those sort of things. It may be complicated, as Karen went through, but they kind of have the structure there to be able to hand off those advice queries, know how to deal with them, and where to go from there. The real concern is those really small bureaus, thinking people who potentially just run payroll of their own accord. They have a few clients that may be, the local butcher, the local hairdresser, a few small businesses around town, and just really sort of like a local, really small business. Those people don't necessarily have the resources to be able to deal with the extra burden that any of those extra regulations could bring, and potentially aren't part of a membership body like the CIPP to have that extra backing. And sort of maybe mandating that they have a professional body to go to, or a regulatory body in that case, would put quite a bit of extra pressure on them. It's whether that's the right thing to do. And I don't know whether at the moment the particular areas that they're trying to raise standards in, doing that, I think the government currently thinks that would be a bit of a, using a sledgehammer to drive in a small nail sort of thing. They really look at trying to hone in on those areas of non-compliance, Simon said, around some umbrella companies and sort of employment companies that are really doing things wrong. They want regulations that are going to stymie them without stymieing the people that are doing things correctly in the first place. So I think there's still a lot of exploring here to do from the government side that'll come out in the future. But hopefully not too much of a burden on smaller employers, as I'm sure Karen will get involved in with ABAB.
Fantastic. Well, look, I'm conscious that a lot of people want to get to some of the other topics we still want to get to. We've got another poll as well, so fingers at the ready on your buzzers. We're going to go to poll number 2, which is, will your business be conducting a compliance review in response to these updates? We've got 3 options for you here for those in audio only. We've got yes, planning a review, no, not at this time, and 3, considering it. While we're waiting for that poll to come in, we've had a question come in here, which comes in from Daniel, that says, what goes back to the first part of the show, and it says, when employing individuals who reside outside the UK, such as in the EU, what should be considered from a payroll administration perspective, and what arrangements do we need to make? Perhaps I'll come to, I don't know, Karen, we talked a little bit about this during the show. Do you mind if I come to you for this?
I don't mind. We're talking global payroll, though, which is not my specialism, although I have worked within an organisation with global payroll. I think that there's a number of things, and it's not just around the payroll side. It's obviously, are they resident? I'm assuming here, based on that question, that whilst it's the UK business employing them, if they are resident in their own country, then it's, you will need to operate a payroll in that country. Because they are not UK residency. So first of all, is residency will be critical to understand. And I'm sure Simon will have views on this as well, because SD Works obviously do global payrolls. So doing that. Then once you've done that, it's a case of then considering, well, who is going to run that payroll for you? Will you look to a global provider? Will you look for an in-country partner who will do that for you, or an agent in country? So obviously there's social security. So, the reciprocal agreements, but as I say, initially, because they're not going to work in the UK, they are in fact, and I'm assuming resident over there, they would fall under their own tax rules.
Simon, let me come to you. Have anything you'd like to add to Karen's response?
No, I think Karen's pretty spot on. Sometimes I think there's this view that lots think because they're overseas, you then have to put them on the UK payroll. If they're not UK tax resident, they're not on a UK payroll, but you do need a payroll for where they are resident. So you may then take on the obligations. So consideration is, what nation are they in, and what are the employment rights? there as well, because you may find there's employer obligations in relation to the employment rights of where they are resident, and just consider that. And then there's an element of, do you want to bring them into the UK to do any work? Because you then got to consider whether they have a right to do that, and whether that's short-term business visiting or some other measure, and are they really a UK worker that you can't employ because they don't have rights to work here? And so there's all those sorts of considerations. But it's a common question we get, Nick, on the social media is, I've got such and such. And quite often we've got a lot, certainly over the past few years and since COVID came in, where actually you had people that were UK tax residents that went home. When I say home, Eastern European, some other European nations, Southern Europe as well, Spain or whatever, and it's sort of oh, by the way, we've been home working for the past 3 years. I've actually been in Spain for 2, and the employer didn't even know. They still thought they were in Basildon. And there's an element of now are there retrospective obligations placed on that employer because actually they're no longer a UK tax resident. So there are implications in relation to international employment. It'd be nice to think there's global tax, maybe for simplification purposes. In other ways, maybe not. There's no such thing as global, really. This terminology I used in my master's was glocalization, and that's sort of the model that SD Works work is, where you've got a global solution that operates localized obligations.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. It's a tough subject because there are so many different solution providers and so many options for employing someone outside of the UK. I definitely recommend that you do your research, but hopefully that helps you, Daniel, with your question. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Simon. Let's have a look at some of the results of this poll then. We've got a pretty even split here. 31% those in audio only say that yes, planning a review. 36% say no, not at this time. And 33% say considering it. Now, come to you, Richard. Any thoughts on those results?
Probably not. No, I think it's one of those things. It depends. It's business by business type. So you would expect with a variety of businesses that you'd get a fairly equal score, depending on what they do. So I would suggest probably considering it would be higher rather than no. But no, I think it's fairly adequate.
Fair enough. Sounds like we need to be having more controversial based polls. If anyone has any ideas that's watching or listening to this, put it in the questions box and we'll try and include it next time. Let's jump into the next section. And I know this is a section that people are keen to hear more about, which is mandatory payrolling in kind, or PBIKs. How is this going to impact payroll and finance departments, double work, the exceptions? Is it going to be different now? And will your benefit providers be ready? Now, bearing in mind Simon works for a provider, I'm going to come to him last on this one. I'm going to come to you first, Karen, because you're smiling happily and I can tell you're ready for this. Give us a little bit of an overview.
Oh, that's just so mean, Nick.
Yes.
Disappointment is a nice word I will use for where we are at this point in time. Payrolling of benefits voluntarily, we've known, has been around for years, albeit they made it a little bit complicated when they first did it. And with the exception of accommodation and loans, we've known that for a very long time, that those two, because of the way the legislation is written, you can't payroll. Now, for some very bizarre reason, HMRC seem to have just cottoned on to that. I'm going to be quite blunt. The way that they are conducting consultations. So ultimately, the answer to mandatory payrolling of benefits in 2026 is it's okay. You can do accommodation and loans, but you can do it voluntarily. But if you do, you'll need to do lots and lots of checks at the year end, and likely a month 13. Oh, and by the way, the Class 1A will also be different too. Because with payrolling of benefits, the intention is that Class 1A will also go period by period as well. However, when asked the question of, well, is Class 1A, so will you take your payroll, for example, for the full month of, oh, by the way, what are we actually reporting? Nope, we don't know that yet either. We do that. How will we show Class 1A? Will it be by individual? and component? Will we take the payroll and our software say, here's all the BICs that are subject to class 1A, that's the payment due, and it will just form part of the P32 somewhere along the line? I mean, I'm being a bit flippant, but I think, to be fair, with good reason, in that the latest was, we will have something to share with you perhaps around summer 2025, which for anybody on this call in a payroll world is just not good enough. It is unacceptable. Never mind. And then to be told, oh, well, it's okay, payroll software only update in October, so as long as we've got it for then, it'll be okay. No, it won't, because it take about 18 months to deliver it, particularly if you're wanting more fields, particularly if you're going to try and link class 1A in some way. And even more so, why didn't you get your finger out and determine new legislation that would make accommodation and loans to be able to be put through payrolling of benefits? So for my view at the moment, and I'm not thinking about, me personally here, it doesn't impact, but when I think about our clients, particularly small businesses here, who will have company vans, they will have cars. They might have had vans in the past, and now their double cab pickup is now a car, as we go through with stuff like that as well, to contend with. Sorry, I know, Matthew, you're laughing, but it really is. So when you do this, and it's 2026, along with everything else that a small business is doing, either if HMRC want this to be introduced, although they may do they've said they'll do a soft landing with penalties, whoopity-doo, you don't get penalised for getting it wrong, even though you don't know what you're actually looking to submit. But at the end of the day, where we are now, to be frank, is very disappointing, because if this is coming in 2026, I'm not filled with confidence that we will actually be able to deliver it. Those businesses that potentially don't use an agent on this occasion may be better placed because it's their own employer and they're dealing with that. But where you use an outsourcer, we've got to obtain that information. We have to test our software, we have to change our processes by way of getting this information, and so forth. And then, of course, leading back to the previous part of, where does the advice come in? I've got 2 payrolling of benefits. Oh, I now want to do a van. Is it a van? How does that line fit? So there's so much for us to be thinking about, and to be fair, we have all been thinking about it, but we just couldn't enact on any of it until we had confirmation. But looks like summer's going to be a busy time.
Isn't it
So
always?
I'll end there.
I came to you first. Oh, that was a pretty good and robust response to the question. I've had Richard who's been attacked by his cat, I think, at the same time. Richard, let me come to you then. Either yourself or your cat, welcome to give a view.
Dog. No, he's very emotional
about
payrolling of benefits, mandatory. He won't shut up about it. No, I think if you ask me, so when we talk about it with clients and when we talk about it on updates, funny enough, the thing that makes people most emotional is the 50% limit. And fun enough, we were having a meeting earlier on this subject. In principle, obviously, you cannot take more than 50% of tax. If you're going to start adding a chunk of benefits onto the payroll, notionally, it is going to increase the tax significantly in some cases. And the expectation is obviously it will just roll on. The problem you've got is it could just roll on forever, because the likelihood is the benefits won't change, the 50% threshold won't change, the level of income will only go up, and on those grounds, how does the circle ever stop? And I think for a lot of businesses, therefore, more than anything else, this could bring in a huge amount of confusion with the workforce, because trying to explain to them this, and the fact that we are reporting it but we're just not deducting it from you, could mean a numerous different outcomes depending on situation of leaving, going on maternity, for instance, where the income suddenly drops substantially. There are so many bits to the pie that we just don't have an answer to, and I think that's really, really, really difficult.
Let me come to you, Matthew, then with a question we've had come in. It comes in from Joanna, who says, how does payrolling benefits in kind work with a 2P process running partway through the tax year? Would you need to P11D benefits for the remainder of the tax year?
Wow, I think that sort of ties into what Rich is saying there. We don't really have the sort of full answers on how this will work when it's all mandatory. So that's a scary question. That I don't think I fully know the answer to that. If
Lucky I
I'm
didn't get
afraid,
that one.
Nick.
I was going to say, well, I think if I can interject from an employment
Go on,
law
Karen.
perspective,
Take it.
TUPE is employment law. Yeah, TUPE is employment law, nothing to do with tax and nothing to do with payroll in that respect. So what you're really looking at here is you've taken on TUPE employees who are currently payrolling of benefits. So it's at the negotiation stage of how then are you going to manage that? If the company taking those employees doesn't currently payroll benefits, bearing in mind, in a way, your get at is, well, you can't, even if you wanted to, until April. So you'd have to register to do it. So actually, it'd be impossible for you to payroll those benefits in kind. So you would need to make sure you communicate to say, that's going to stop, here's where it is at this point, and then do P11Ds for the remainder, would be my suggestion. But please note, I am not giving advice. I would suggest that that would be an option to consider. If you do payrolling of benefits and those employees have been on P11D, if it were me, I would keep them on P11D and then I'd put them onto payroll income April, so that I had a nice year of the same thing, not trying to move partway through a year. But that's just my some of that was my personal view. But just differentiate between the two. It's always this red herring. Is TUPE and payroll. It is a red herring. It is employment law.
Can you
Okay,
tell
so
them
you
that
and
the
Simon-
The other way
TUPE
round. I was
transfer
going
when I
to say,
worked
sorry,
in
you know,
payroll?
you could have a situation where it's the other way round. So the previous company could have been payrolling, but you don't.
Yeah, which is sort of the question. Yeah, so at the moment, you can do either. From 26, you have no choice, but you don't need to register in 26. So the registration requirement that came back in 2016 ends for the 2025-26 tax year. Is the last year there's a registration requirement before the 5th of April.
Just
Unless
to
it's
build on that,
accommodation
though,
alone.
Unless it's
you
accommodation.
will have to register for the accommodation and loans from that, because it is voluntary. So if you do want to do that voluntarily, not that I think it would be wise, because it would be very complicated, as Karen sort of alluded to, but you would need to register for that.
That's right. And of course, you can't do it at all at the moment, payrolling, because it's not permitted. So that's sort of an April 26 question. But if you had medical benefits and you're transferring, but a lot of the answer, and you know, I think Karen was probably alluding to it, is it depends on the nature of the TUPE, because TUPE could mean actually it's the same PAYE scheme, there is absolutely no change. Or it could mean it's a different PAYE scheme. So actually an employment ends and a new employment starts. And we see lots of questions on social media about this because they're saying, well, the employment hasn't ended. Well, actually, HMRC tax-wise, it has. So you're actually a P45 leaver, even if you don't get a P45 and you are a P45 starter, even if they don't really use the P45, because that's the way it's represented on the HMRC transaction. So it all depends on what the PAYE structures are. So if the PAYE structure is inherited, you have actually already registered. But if it's changed, you haven't, because HMRC don't really get their head around the fact that it's the same employment. They don't treat it that way because they treat every PAYE scheme, even if you're part of a group, as being completely separate employer. And so we often see, and we deal with transfers between one and another, and you can say it's continuous, and they all work for ACME. It's just that ACME has 200 PAYE schemes and they keep on swapping around. That's continuous employment. It is employment rights wise, it's not from HMRC wise. They're completely separate. And so it's just be aware of that. But in 26, I'm thinking if it's med bens, you've got no choice, you've got to payroll. At the moment, yeah, just stop it and start again from the new employment on whatever method you're registered for. That's so P11D. Not that that's tax advice, and that comes under the disclaimer at the beginning of the presentation today.
It does indeed. Well, I'm going to move on to the next section because it's a section we didn't quite get to in the last PQT, and we had promised everyone we wouldn't miss it this time round. It's a hot topic on social media at the minute. Everyone trying to get to grips with what the future of payroll will look like, particularly with every second social media post or sales leaflet that you get having the words "driven by AI" in quotation marks attached to every single one. It's got a few people a little bit nervous, and potentially rightly so, because not everyone understands what the future looks like. And of course, we can't necessarily predict it, but we can make an attempt. I've done so in some disruptive newsletters myself, and I've had a fair bit of kickback on those, so much so I had to add a tongue-in-cheek disclaimer just to confirm that I am not in fact a fortune teller. I am actually just making predictions that may or may not come true. But it's funny sometimes how people read it and think, oh no, is this really going to happen?
To be a fortune teller though, Nick, do you have to be accredited as a fortune teller? Or is
Well, a lot of recruitment, fortunately not. I think I even put my disclaimer title is the Payroll Profit, not Nostradamus disclaimer, just to let people know that everything I'm saying here is, just a guess at where the industry I think is headed. It's an educated speculation with a dash of imagination. I actually had to put on there that my goal is to spark ideas, but don't quote me on that because they really are just predictions, not promises. And sudden urges to modernize systems as a result is completely down to you. But obviously I've got my own views. I see it from a very different lens. My views are really formed from payroll managers and professionals like the panel we have here that I talk to regularly. But I want to come to you guys first. So Richard, you have a very unique perspective as Director of Education at Payroll Centre. What's your view on the future of payroll? What are the trends? What's the noise you're hearing? What are the things you're excited about?
Okay, I think it's multiple at the moment, and it's quite interesting. And Matthew was there last week. We actually spent a very nice day with one of the large providers last week, and it was very interesting to hear their philosophy, especially on the first one. So principally, it's about the pay cycle. We've spoken about it several times on these in previous history, where it is pay on demand, and it is the future. Whether you like it or not, it's coming. But actually, just how flexible is it going to be, and what does it look like? We're hearing now that working a shift, finishing the shift and the overtime, and the money being there then. So it's where does it end? Where does it stop? How real time does pay become? Where in certain industries already, it's a non-negotiable. If you look at hospitality, a number of the retail sectors like betting shops, for instance, you don't have it, people don't work for you. So whether we like it or not, and excuse the pun, it's coming up on the stand side rail. It's going to have a bigger and bigger impact, especially obviously as the gens move into higher roles. So we're talking about, the youth of today having a very different contemplation of work, contemplation of pay, contemplation of bills that a very young person like myself would have. So, they're now talking about Generation Alpha, which is the next lot, who aren't working yet, who will have an even different expectation to those working today. And if you want to look that one up, you'll find it's the 10s to 14-year-old or 10 to 16-year-olds today. They've branded them as well because they're coming with another different model again. So it's how do we keep up with the demands of those people? And I think that's critical. I could speak all day about AI, but I'll let somebody else have a go.
Let me come to you, Simon, because you and I have had various chats about early wage access, pay on demand. Will it result in a dissolution of the monthly pay cycle, or traditional pay cycle, should I say, as we know it? And you've always been quite steadfast in your view. Has that changed?
No, not really. And I guess you could say maybe a bit vocal. Early wage access is a bandage. Is a personal view. It just fixes a potential demand that will come along. I think payday flexibility is the reality that's to come. But I guess I understand that early wage access also deals with the cash flow aspect of a business. But there was a time 30 years ago, 40 years ago maybe, when all mortgages came out on the 1st of the month. And there's an element of now mortgages come out on whatever day you choose. So there is there, and I'd like to see it, because SD Works do not operate a batch engine payroll anymore. It's transactional based. So there's an element of you've got the ability to do a single calculation today. However, they all seem to be paid on the same day of the month because people choose that way. And there's an element, do we actually now have the IT power to actually say, no, I'm traditionally used to being paid on the 15th. Can I be paid on the 15th? And the person opposite me is traditionally paid on the 17th, can be paid on the 17th. So my angle from there, Nick, is I think lots of people are cyclical still. They'll just want to have the flexibility to choose when they're paid. Now, some of them, we've had industries that have had trouble because we've gone through, in the days when I did my diploma, which was in the late 90s, sort of thing, the work that you did for your diploma, now the degree that the CIPP do, but in those days, the diploma, you'd be very much doing papers on moving from weekly to monthly. And the trends over the past few years is actually some of the retail industry can't recruit on monthly. So they've gone back and reverted to weekly. And there's an element of, why either? So my challenge is the traditional pay cycles potentially are irrelevant. If you want to be paid monthly, choose it. If you want to be paid weekly, choose it. But I think the IT power is there to do it. Now, there may be business constraints as to why you wouldn't want to do that, because that affects your cash flow and everything else. But as Richard's implying, the gig economy drive is for that flexibility to be there. So maybe we need to mature. But is that early wage access? I think early wage access is just a fix to a monthly cycle. I think the true future is to look beyond that, is to say you choose when you get paid. Now, will people choose to be paid daily? My gut feel is no. They'll choose to be paid monthly, quite a lot of people, but they'll choose when. And that might cycle with when their mortgage payment goes out or some other. And then there was the other model that the former chair of CIPP, going back, so not the chair, the CEO of CIPP got involved with, was Melvin, that to the extent that for some of them, you can choose, you're still paid monthly, but you can choose to be paid weekly through a sort of an early wage access model, which again was different. And there's an element of, has it scope? But there's an element of thinking technology these days, just choose when you want to be paid. I guess that will start alarm bells in the industry, because I don't think we're ready for it as a profession, because we like our cycles. But there's an element of...
You raise an interesting point there, Simon, because the technology exists to do a lot of wonderful things. It's whether or not we're ready to deploy it.
Yes,
if we think of, I mean, blockchain and Bitcoin are buzzwords at the moment, but blockchain in particular, for fractional workers and gig economy workers, the ability to have smart contracts that execute pay immediately on small hours and make micro payments could be a fantastic solution. But the price and of deployment and whether or not we're ready for that technology at the moment is a whole different question. And I think that's the point I made on a recent post on LinkedIn. I got into a conversation with Max van der Kisper about this, saying, what do we need to do then to prepare ourselves? I said, these things may be ready now, but we've got time to evolve. We've got time to learn, because they're not going to be instantly and readily available tomorrow, even though the technology may already exist for that to be, in theory, possible. Of course, it never quite happens like that, and will evolve as the payroll industry always has to the technologies that come. I think there's also a lot of confusion around AI, but then again, a lot of payroll departments have been working with what I would call old AI for years, robotic process automation and things like that. It's the new LLM type AI models that are exciting people, but the roles they play in payroll are going to be different from organization to organization. And again, they're going to be so familiar by the time they get deployed in everyone's day-to-day workloads that I think it'll be a lot easier to make those adjustments. Interestingly, we've already had some comments come in here, so I'm going to mention an observation on your point, Simon, from Joanne, that said the mortgage still only comes out once a month. Whichever date it is will go to daily or weekly payments. I've got a PBIK question, which I'll come to in just a moment, Terry, so thank you for that. Let's come back to yourself, Karen. Obviously, at the moment, working in an accountancy organisation that is paying a lot of different companies. I'm sure that technology is front and centre as well in terms of how you can streamline and become more efficient and more compliant and more accurate and all of those things. How are you seeing the future of payroll evolve from your perspective?
Well, I'm with Simon on the early wage access. I view that as, people who suddenly get into financial difficulty, and I never ever supported personally. This is things like payday loans and what have you. I think it can get people further into debt, but that's a personal view. So I don't think it's more. You may still have that, but not so. I agree with Simon that on choosing your payday, I think I can't speak for the alpha generation that Richard said. I didn't even know there was one. It fills me with dread, for goodness God. Hopefully I'll be retired by the time they come to and run the world. But I think choose your payday, again, I think the technology from a payroll perspective will be there if it's not already. Because obviously we, as an agent, we're paying people on all sorts of different days anyway. It's just all of them on a particular day if they're monthly or weekly. But I think it's going to come down to things like national minimum wage legislation. It's on a pay reference period. So, wow, good luck changing that. What would that pay reference period look like? How will the employer know that day of, I've clocked in or I've turned up for work and this is what I work? So I'm not saying it's impossible. I think there's just a lot of, sick pay. Now, okay, this government may decide it's from day one, but while we've got PIWs and waiting days, it's legislation that needs to be really thought out. And I think one of the issues that the UK has with that is our political terms, because you can't achieve very much in 5 years in reality when you're looking at big stuff like that. So I think you'd have to have sort of like an independent, multi-faceted, political parties, industry experts, things like that to go together. Is it impossible? No, but I don't think it's imminent, but I do think it will come. AI is an interesting one. I mean, I'm all for if a robot can do it or if something can do it and I don't have to, brilliant. My favorite at the moment, my buzzword is Copilot. My God, I don't know how I have ever survived life without it. I use it for all sorts of stuff. I love payroll. I hate accounts, but being a head of service line, I have to do the P&L stuff. And there's nothing better than taking your figures, putting it into Copilot, which of course doesn't mean it goes into the World Wide Web, I might add. Put it into there and say, go and summarize that for me. And it does. And you're like, great, another job done. So I'm very much as to see where AI goes.
I think on the Copilot point is interesting, because I think that's when we think of AI, they're the kind of solutions we immediately code towards, the LLMs, the chat GPTs, the Copilots, things that can make sort of simple things quite easy for us to put into a logical order, to summarize and things like that. I think some of the AI capabilities that I'm excited about, I did an article on no code payroll solutions. I think we're going to see a proliferation of those potentially come to the market because it's very easy to do now. But I think it's some of the things like biometrics, the idea that, from facial recognition, particularly in the States, well, obviously we have US recruitment there, where you have a lot of ghost employees, a lot of buddy punching, things like that. Where actually, if you're able to use AI for facial recognition to make sure, from a TNA perspective, that employee is on site and it is that employee, I think those kind of use cases, and they're things we're already using every day when you unlock an iPhone, you unlock an Android phone. So we already have the capability, but I think they're the kind of examples of AI use cases which can really improve compliance and actually the accuracy as well, because you can monitor the time someone undertakes those actions and it's right down to the minute. And I think they're the things that aren't being discussed about as much, because I don't think they're as exciting for headlines.
I don't know. Where I work now, I've got an app, and when I walk into the building, it says I'm there, and it's for health and safety reasons. But you would be gobsmacked, probably not actually, Nick, how many employees that turn around and say, that means when I've got home, if I've gone to the spa, and it's like, no, it doesn't. We could turn that on, but that's not what it's there for. So it does exist. And though, it's just this privacy bit. And of course, Americans are even worse for privacy laws. So I think that, again, it comes back to, it's not that we couldn't do it or we wouldn't want to do it. It's the legislation and the stuff that fits around all this that you've got to protect. Because I was going to say, with Bitcoin blockchain, it may as well be a different language for us, as far as I'm concerned. I'm old school. I haven't got a clue, never want to. But I was reading on LinkedIn from a colleague who actually nearly got scammed with this. In the fact that they were doing his bank, they wanted his card, they had all his card details, everything. And this is somebody who is in the know, let's just put it that way. And what they were trying to do, as it turned out, was actually buy Bitcoin using his bank account, as it turns out in his bank. So when I hear things like that, it puts me off even more, because it's all electronic. There's no human. I mean, I have gone past going into a bank because they don't exist anymore to go and get cash. I don't do that. I'm well beyond that. But it's these kind of things I think we have to, education is going to be quite key to fully understand.
You raise a good point, because Bitcoin and blockchain probably shouldn't be together in a sentence, really, because blockchains is a transparent ledger where you can follow those things. Bitcoin is a digital currency essentially, which can be executed on the blockchain, but they are different and can certainly be used in very different use cases. I'm going to put a link to the SD Works Navigator Report 2024. I did a webinar with Simon at SD Works quite recently, which actually does give some really interesting statistics on AI usage within the payroll industry. I think it was as low as, if memory serves me correct, 23 or 29%, certainly less than 30%, in terms of acknowledged AI being used within a payroll operation. I suspect the number's probably higher, just people don't realize it is AI they're potentially using in certain examples. But I think it's a really interesting report, so I'll put a link to that in the chat in just a moment for anyone that might be interested. A comment came in from Stephanie saying, I've got a crystal ball, Nick, if you want one in our payroll department. Yes, please, I'll send my address to you separately. My disclaimer for a bit of fun I put in the chat as well. Matthew, I'm going to come to you, CIPP. Obviously, we've done roundtables on AI, we've done roundtables on the future of payroll quite recently. I know it's a space that CIP are really keen to understand and make sure that you have the knowledge to know and to guide. So what's your view on the future of payroll?
Yeah, I'm going to very much sit on the fence about pay on demand and wage access. Anecdotally, I've heard different things from different sides. There's companies that have very successfully implemented pay on demand. There's companies that have implemented pay on demand and say that their uptake of it is actually relatively low, which in some ways could be deemed as a success, that their employees don't feel the need to access their wage outside of the normal cycles. Our stance has always really been that if you are going to implement pay on demand, that it should be implemented alongside good financial well-being safeguards for employees, because really you want to avoid people feeling the need to access their wage early for financial situations that could have been avoided. So there's always that. I think personally, maybe there is almost an element of the tail wagging the dog in terms of bringing in pay on demand. I think it's come from America that has vastly different attitudes towards salary and wages. I think predominantly they still operate on a 2-weekly pay cycle. There's a lot of places where there's almost an inherent distrust of their employer, where they want their money because why should you have it in your bank account when it could be sat in mine? So I think there's different attitudes there. So a lot of potentially big software companies operating in America are trying to bring that over here. There's also different countries in Europe that have different attitudes to it. And I'm not necessarily sure it's fitting in well with the sort of financial culture within the UK. Whether it is going to come and we have to put up with it, like Richard said, that's a completely different case and a completely different question. So we may have to adapt to it. And if the younger generations are pushing for it and want it, and you don't have it, that starts posing a recruitment issue, which will then be for you to resolve, Nick. But it's definitely something that is coming and you might want to explore, but it definitely doesn't mean that you should be implementing it right now. It's also good to just ask your employees what they want. You might have a demographic that loves it, you might have a demographic that won't use it, and that's sort of for you to assess with your company. With regards to AI, I won't sort of prattle on about that too long, Nick. I know you want to wrap up. I think, like you said, you've got different things. You've got process automation and you've got LLM AI. What I really want to see more of in the payroll space is that sort of like error recognition and recognizing when something's gone wrong with a payroll, you sort of variance reports and things like that, where the AI can step in those situations. The issue you've got with that is training the data without putting it out into the internet, like Karen was saying. You know, you don't want your private company data out in training data sets, and that I think is the hurdle that we've got at the moment.
Fantastic. Now, apologies, I can't keep us on this subject for too much longer. I've got to give everyone the dates of the SD Works Academy, and I'm conscious of time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring the slide up for everyone to take a look at. You can see the links and the dates to the courses. And while they're live, I'm going to come to Simon first on 2 questions. I want to make sure our listeners and our viewers get maximum value for the show today. So the first question comes in from Terry Baker. And of course, for those interested in the Academy, please do make a note of these, because I'm not going to run through them during the show, so just please make a note and sign up for those if you can. Most of these courses are free to attend as well, and you can see them in front of you on the slide. So question, when payrolling BIKs, will there be a period of double taxation, i.e. BIK becomes taxed at source from the April and the personal allowance increases accordingly, then the P11D is submitted a few months later, which would then reduce the personal allowance again, effectively taxing employees for the previous and current tax year at the same time. Asking, is this would affect the comms to inform employees of the change?
Potentially, Nick,
if possible.
Yeah, potentially, Nick, it does, but not quite maybe in the reader's or the asker's understanding. And equally, that happens now. So in the first year of receiving a benefit, you're probably not paying any tax on it at all. After the first year is reported, they will tax you for the prior year you weren't taxed and the year you're now in. But when you go to payrolling, the tax coding of the current year is taken out. So you don't have a double taxation just because you've gone to PBIK. You've got a double taxation because of the lag of the P11D. Now, for new people, of course, they won't get that because they'll be taxed in real time. But the big shock that most people have is they get a company car or whatever, and then in the second year, midway through, they get a full year for the last year, the current half year, plus through to the rest of the year on their tax coding, and then they're picking that up on the year after. So there is sort of that double point, but actually PBIK makes it better, I'd suggest.
Good. And very quickly, conscious of time, last question. So I'm going to just come to Simon on this. I know there's some commentary. Maybe we'll come to this again in future webinars, but conscious of everyone's time. PBIK, how will this work when setting up payrolls mid-year? PBIK can only be set up at the beginning of the tax year if they are mandatory. Can we set up PBIK for day one setup?
Well, potentially, yes. The restriction at the moment is the registration requirement. Yeah, so it's not the payroll that's restricting a mid-year setup. It's His Majesty's Revenue and Customs that are restricting it because they don't let you. But when it becomes mandatory, that will go away, apart from the indication is for accommodation and beneficial loans, which will have its own set of rules because they haven't figured out how to do it yet.
Fantastic. I'm going to finish off with a comment from Louise. I think it's a nice way to finish today's show. Bearing in mind the next PQT, if you are hopefully going to join us again, is going to be on Thursday, the 30th of January, 2025. Louise says, hey guys, in case I'm unable to stay to the end, I just want to wish everyone on the panel a very happy Christmas. I really enjoy PQT and I enjoy listening back to the talks in the evenings via the Payroll podcast or on YouTube with a glass of wine. Thank you for the information and the payroll chat. It's really appreciated. See you all in 2025. Thank you, Louise Pearson, for that. I imagine she may have already left because she said that a little bit earlier. Thank you to our panel today. And thank you everyone who's checked in and joined us, whether this is your first PQT or whether you've joined us all the way through. We look forward to welcoming you back in 2025. I've been your host. My name is Nick Day, and you've been joined today by Karen Thompson, Matthew O'Quigg, Simon Parsons, and Richard George. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I can't believe I'm saying that in November.
Merry Christmas.